Okay class, welcome to our first video lesson. We're going to be doing about 2 or 3 of these videos a week. What I need for you to do now is go ahead and take out your composition notebook and in the table of contents put special segments in triangles. This corresponds with chapter 5.1 in our textbook, and today we're going to be talking about median and altitude. So go ahead and turn to that first available page, and at the top you're going to put median. We're going to talk about medians first. Medians are a line segment. And they are a line segment, and like you think the word median, you think of the word middle. And it's a line segment that stretches from one vertex of the triangle to the midpoint, or the middle, of the opposite side. So if I am looking at triangle ACB, let's say we wanted to make a median from A all the way to side CB. So it would look something like this. So we would say that AD is a median. And since D is the midpoint of CB, that means that CD, this line segment, is congruent to DB, this line segment, because if this is a midpoint, that means everything to the left has to be equal to everything to the right. So this is our first example of a median. Okay? Here we have an obtuse triangle, RSP. Okay? Let's say we wanted to make a median from R all the way down to SP, so we know it has to go to the midpoint. Let's say T is our midpoint. So we're going to stretch a line all the way from R down to our midpoint T. So that would make RT a median, and it would also mean that T is the midpoint of SP, so therefore ST is equal to TP. Okay? And in our third example, we have a right triangle here. Okay? And so we're going to stretch a median from G all the way across to J, the midpoint of FH. And so here is just a third example for you to see. And since J is the midpoint, that means FJ is going to be congruent to JH. So again, GJ is a median, and J is the midpoint of FH. Okay, and now going back to our idea, our definition of a midpoint, that means that in this initial triangle we said CD has to be equal to DB. And another thing that's true is if I take CD and I add it to DB, well then it's going to give me the whole thing CB. Okay, and the same is true with the rest of these. ST is congruent to TP, and when I add ST to TP it's going to give me the whole thing SP. And same thing on this last one, FJ is equal to JH, and FJ plus JH is going to give me the whole thing FH. Okay? Now the next thing I want to ask you is, can we have more than one median in a triangle? So let's look at our first example. We have triangle ABC here. And let's draw our first median from A all the way down. We'll call this point F. Okay? And since this is point F, we know that BF is going to be congruent to FC. But we can also draw a median from B all the way across to this other side. We'll call this point E, and so BE is a median, which means that AE is going to be congruent to EC. And yet we can make one more median from point C all the way across to AB. So here's median, we'll call it CD, and that means that AD is going to be congruent to DB. So yes, each triangle is going to have 3 medians, one for each side, because we're going to the midpoint D, E, and F of each side. Now if you notice, all 3 of these medians meet up in the middle. They meet up at a common point, and there's a vocabulary word that you need to know for this. This is one of our points of concurrency, and this is what we call the centroid. So anytime 3 medians meet, it is called a centroid, and that's something you need to go ahead and write down and highlight. Alright, so that is our intro on medians. So now we're going to talk about altitudes. Alright, and when you think of altitude, you think of height. Right? An altitude is a line segment. We're essentially going to measure the height of a triangle. And if you think about it, when you go to the doctor's office and you get measured for how tall you are, they don't measure you at an angle, they measure you straight up and down. So it's very important that an altitude is always perpendicular to the opposite side. Okay, perpendicular means that it's going to create what kind of angle? It's going to create a 90-degree angle. So if we look at our first triangle, again we have ABC here. And if I'm going to create an altitude from C straight down, there is the height of my triangle. There is what we call our altitude. We'll call it CD here. And what's very important is that it does form that 90-degree angle. Anytime you see altitude, that's the one thing you need to remember, that it creates an altitude. Sorry, that it creates a 90-degree angle. Now here, this one's a little different. We have an obtuse triangle. So it's going to be tough to measure the height inside of it. So our altitude this time is actually going to be on the outside. We're going to go from R straight down to see how tall our triangle is. And once again, it makes that 90-degree angle. Okay. Now here, FHG, this looks like a right triangle. Okay. Now in this case, how many altitudes do we have? We actually have two. We have FH and we have GH, because both of them form that 90-degree angle. So like we said, FH is an altitude and GH is also an altitude because they form that right angle, that 90-degree angle. Here we said RT was our altitude, and because RTS forms a 90-degree angle, and here CD is our altitude because angle CDB is 90 degrees as well. Okay, so altitude's real basic. It just means it's a straight line that forms a 90-degree angle. Okay? And let's ask ourselves that same question. Can we have more than one altitude in a triangle? So here we've got triangle ABC. And let's make an altitude from point A. I want to measure the height straight down. Real simple. We have altitude AF, and it makes a 90-degree angle. But guess what? If I were to turn this or rotate it, we would want to measure the height if B is the top. Well, if B is the top, we're going to draw a line straight across. We'll call it BE, and it also forms that 90-degree angle. And we can say the same thing with C. We'll draw a line straight across, CD, and it has to form again that 90-degree angle. So here we have three altitudes, AF, CD, and BE, and if you notice, all three form again that 90-degree angle. That is the one thing you need to remember whenever you hear altitude. Okay, so yes, the answer to our question is every triangle has three altitudes, one for each side. And if you notice, again, they're meeting at a central point. Okay, now this point's in a different location than when all three medians met. So it's going to have a different name. This is another point of concurrency for us. And so we call this the orthocenter. So this point where all three altitudes meet is what we call the orthocenter. Okay? So that is our notes on altitude and our notes on median. Now we're going to go do some practice problems. I've got three problems that we're going to do together. Okay? And these can continue to put these in your notes. So here's our first practice problem. We have triangle XYZ. And our problem states that WZ is a median in that triangle. So again, if WZ is the median, that means W has to be our midpoint. Okay? And then the first thing it tells us is WY equals 3x plus 4. So let's go ahead and label that. And then it says WX is 4x minus 6. And it wants us to find XY. Okay? Well, if you notice, XY is that entire side. Okay? But the key here is that it tells us WZ is a median. And median means we're going to the midpoint of side XY. Well, if W is the midpoint, then that means everything to the left has to equal everything to the right. So we're going to take these two equations and we're going to set them equal to each other. Okay? And just some quick review, we want to go ahead and solve this. So I'm going to move my 3x over to the other side, and we do that by subtraction. So I subtract 3x from both sides, and it simplifies to x minus 6 equals 4, because those 3x's cancel out. And now I still want to get x by itself, so I want to move the negative 6 to the other side, and the way I do that is I add 6. So these cancel out now, and I'm left with x equals 10. But are we done? They asked us for the measurement of xy. Well, xy is this entire side, so what we need to do with this x is we've got to plug it back in. So we're going to go find wy, and we're going to plug in 10 for 3x plus 4. So for wy, we've got 3 times 10 plus 4 gives me 34, so the measure of wy is 34. And we're going to do the same thing with wx. We're going to plug in 10, and we get 4 times 10 minus 6 also gives me 34, which is what we said. These two had to be equal. 34 has to equal 34 because W is the midpoint. But we want to know XY. Well, in order to find XY, we have to take WX, and we have to add it to WY. And so that means we're just going to do 34 plus 34. And so our answer, XY, equals 68. Okay? So that's our first practice problem on medians. Go ahead and make some space because we're going to do another one. Here is number 2. We've got another triangle here. And notice we have some lines drawn here. But the one thing they tell us is NS is a median in triangle LNP. So we know NS is our median. They don't tell us anything about LN, so it's there to distract us. Don't worry about it. The first thing they tell us is LS equals 4x plus 2, so let's go ahead and label that. Oop, sorry. LS is 4x plus 2. Then they tell us that LP is 10x minus 8. Well, if you notice, and I kind of already clicked it on accident, but LP is this entire side. So the entire side is 10x minus 8. Well, that's confusing because that's not a lot of information. That's different from what we had last time. We have this piece and we have the whole thing. But if we remember correctly, a median tells me that S is my midpoint. Well, everything to the left of the midpoint has to be equal to everything to the right of the midpoint. So what we can say is that SP has to be the same as LS. Well, if LS is 4x plus 2, we can say SP is also 4x plus 2. So now we have enough information for our equation. And again, going back to the definition of a midpoint in our segment addition postulate, we know that this piece plus this piece is going to give me the whole thing. So we're going to write 4x plus 2 plus 4x plus 2 equals 10x minus 8. Okay? Now with this kind of equation, before we start moving things to the other side, we have to simplify both sides. This side is already simplified. We need to simplify the left, and we do that by combining like terms. So 4x plus 4x gives me 8x. 2 plus 2 gives me 4. So now we've simplified our equation. Now this is just like the last time. We want to move our smaller x to the other side, so we're going to subtract 8x from both sides. And that cancels these out, and we're left with 4 equals 2x minus 8. Well, now we want to add 8 to both sides because again we want x by itself, so we're going to add 8 to both sides, and that gives me 12 equals 2x. And lastly, we want to get rid of this 2, so we're going to divide both sides by 2, and that gives me x equals 6. But we're not done because it's asking for LS. So we have to take this x and we have to plug it in to LS. Well, that's real easy. We just do 4 times 6 plus 2. Well, 4 times 6 is 24 plus 2 is 26, and that is our answer. LS equals 26. Okay? So those are our 2 problems on median. We're going to do one more. And this third one says Pn is an altitude. Okay, so notice now we're talking about altitude. Pn is an altitude in triangle PMO. And the one piece of information they give us is that angle PNM equals 8x plus 2, and we've got to go find x. Well, if you remember correctly, the one thing we wrote down in our notes about altitude is that it has to be perpendicular to the opposite side. And perpendicular means 90 degrees. So the one thing we know is that if this is an altitude, this angle has to be 90 degrees. Well, that makes our problem really easy because it's asking us, well, they give us PNM. And we know PNM is 90 degrees because it's an altitude. Given this information, we just got to say, well, if PNM is 8x plus 2, I can say 8x plus 2 equals 90 degrees. And now we're just going to subtract 2 from both sides, which simplifies to 8x equals 88. We got to get rid of this 8, so we're going to divide on both sides by 8. And that leaves me with x equals 11. Okay, and I apologize if I went very fast. Again, this is my first time doing this, so if you need to go back and pause or rewind, feel free to do that. You can watch this as many times as you like. And remember, in order to get credit for this, you have to answer the questions and fill out the form with your name, your ID number, and your class period on the Longhorn Math website. So make sure you do that and submit it in order to get credit.